Well, good morning, church. So this week, I got a text message from a friend of mine who is going through a bunch of struggles and some trials and just some areas in life where he feels like he's not winning. And he reached out and he said, hey, how do I have faith in God in the middle of the storm? And it's funny that he reached out and texted me that because Hunter and I, a couple weeks ago, started talking about today, and we started looking towards our passage. And the thought came to my mind weeks ago. I wonder what the week of leading up to Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection was like for those around Jesus. I wonder what emotions they went through on Friday when they saw their rabbi, their disciple maker, their leader, their king, their Lord, crucified on a cross. And so it got me thinking, like, what happens inside of us internally? What thoughts go through our brain? What moves in our hearts when in the middle of the storm, in the middle of the trials, in the middle of the darkest days, we don't see the promise. We don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. We might believe it, but we don't experience it. How do we push through in those moments? What does faith look like in the middle of the storm? And that was one of my wonderings. And so I go and I look through the Bible. And thankfully, you turn to the book of Job, and God gives us some insight a little bit into that. He shows us, as Job was being tried by Satan and tempted and in many ways persecuted, he shows us many of Job's thoughts. But then I kind of drifted and I go, okay, what about Abraham? When Abraham's called to leave everything he knows and go to a land that he will be shown, right? Not, hey, go to this specific place on the GPS map and that's where you're going to go. No, God says, go and I will show you the promised land. What's going on in Abraham's mind and heart and soul when that call comes? Or what about Moses when he ends up murdering an Egyptian guard? What's going on in Moses' heart when he flees the land and he's going, I don't know what to do with my life? Or you can think of many other people throughout Scripture in the middle of the darkest times. They're not seeing the promise, but they're believing the promise. You can go to Peter. Just days before, he's told, hey, somebody in this room is going to deny me and knowing me. Jesus says this to Peter. Peter goes, hey, it's not going to be me. It ain't me. And then a couple of days later, where does Peter find himself? It's him. He's right there in the middle of a storm. And in so many ways, his actions would show us that he wasn't acting in faith. And in so many ways, it would be right. But there's some other areas in which we can look at Peter's later life and go, maybe there was just a pause. And so this morning, as we turn our Bibles, if you have them with you, we're going to be in Zechariah chapter 9. Zechariah chapter 9. And for the sake of time, I'm not throwing the verses up on the screen this morning. So I'd encourage you to turn there with me, Zechariah chapter 9. But what we're going to see, if you haven't been with us, we've been walking through this book of Zechariah. It may be an obscure book to you. I think many of us who were raised in the church could have been to church our entire life and maybe have never heard this book preached. But I think this book, in so many ways, speaks to us as a church and speaks to us as a nation in this moment. See, the people of God have been held in captivity for many, many years. They'd been removed from their land. Their temple had been torn. The temple was a way that they worshiped God. It was where God came and dwelt among them, and it was torn down. And then they were released by King Darius of Persia to go back and rebuild the temple and get back to their normal lives. And this is around 536 BC. And they get back and they start to work. They lay the foundation of the temple, and then they stop. Because the enemies and the storms around them were swirling, and they didn't know what else to do. And so they stopped. And so God raises up two men, Haggai and Zechariah, and he says, hey, get them back to work. Zechariah is an encouraging person. God gives him 8 visions in one night. And that's the first 6 chapters of Zechariah, is where God gives him a vision and says, hey, get these folks, get these leaders encouraged. Get these people back to work. And yet, they paused. They stumbled. And where we're going to pick up in chapter 9 is a couple of years later. The temple's not being built. They're still struggling. They've been called out on their sins, as we saw last week in chapter 7. And they've been told in chapter 8 that a coming victory is on the horizon. That God is going to come and win the victories. And here we pick up in Zechariah chapter 9 with an important message for them and an important message for you and for me. And it's the message that even in the midst of the storm, the promise is still there. The promise is still there. Zechariah chapter 9, beginning in verse 1, it says, the burden of the word of the Lord is against the land of Hadrach. Let me stop there. Your Bible may say the oath. Your Bible may say the burden, but what this Hebrew word really breaks down to is kind of this weighty subject. This message from God, this weighty thing is coming from God to the people. The burden of the word of the Lord is coming. And so what this tells you and me as we read the Bible is that this is kind of one of those moments when we need to lean in and pay attention. Because this just isn't a normal word of the Lord. This is a highly expressed word of the Lord. This is a word for all of us to ensure that we understand it completely. He says, the word of the Lord is against the land of Hadrach, and Damascus is its resting place. For the Lord has an eye on mankind and all the tribes of Israel. God is watching them. And on Hamath also, which borders on it, and Tyre and Sidon, though they are very wise. This is a message, though they are very wise. He's going to unpack it here in just a second. But this is a message very similar to Genesis for the Tower of Babel. These are people who think they've got it all figured out. They've built wealth. They've built prosperity. They've built their namesake. These are cities that in so many ways are going, I'm going to do this by my might and by my power. I don't need God's Spirit. And if you were here several weeks ago, that was God's message, is that you won't build something by your might and your power, but you will do it by the Spirit of the living God. And here these cities are going, nope, my might and my power is enough. Tyre and Sidon, though they are very wise. Verse 3, Tyre has built herself a rampart and heaped up silver like dust and fine gold like the mud of the streets. But behold, the Lord will strip her of her possessions and strike down her power on the sea, and she shall be devoured by fire. Now, what we need to keep in mind is these cities are not the cities of people of God. These are the cities of the enemies of God. These are the cities that are coming against God's people. And he's saying, oh, you think you got it all figured out, but it's about to come down. Verse 5, Ashkelon shall see it and be afraid, Gaza too, and shall writhe in anguish. Ekron also, because its hopes are confounded. The king shall perish from Gaza. Ashkelon shall be uninhabited. A mixed people shall dwell in Ashdod. And I will cut off the pride of the Philistia. I will take away its blood from its mouth and its abominations from its teeth. It too shall be a remnant for our God. It shall be like a clan in Judah, and Ekron shall be like the Jebusites. Then I will encamp at my house as a guard, so that none shall march to and fro. No oppressor shall again march over them. For now I see with my own eyes. Here's the gist of what's happening. God's people have been given a task. And in so many ways, they're delaying the task because of these enemies. They're living in sin. God addresses them in the previous chapters. And here in chapter 9, God looks at them and says, your enemies will become like nothing. I will defeat your enemies. The storms in your life, Israel, I'm going to get rid of them. The things that come and weigh down on you, I'm going to lift them. And this is great news to the people of God in this moment. Here's the bad news. This word is given at approximately 532 BC. This prophecy isn't fulfilled until around 332 BC. That means they weren't alive anymore, in case you weren't picking up on that. And so I want us to lean into this moment because I think sometimes we confuse God's promise with our wish. God has declared that He will be the victor of all things. But He has not declared that on this earth for you in that exact moment. Like, in your current battle, you will see eventual victory because of heaven, but you might not see victory on this side of it. And that's a hard truth. That's a hard thing to wrestle with. These people are getting a word from God, an important word, a weighty word, right? And God says, hey, I'm going to clear out all of the things in your way. Oh, but by the way, it'll be done in 200 years. And they sit and they wait. And then through the works of God, a man not of God completes this works for them. And around 330 BC, Alexander the Great fulfills this prophecy. The words of Josephus, a Jewish historian, writes it like this. It said, while Alexander had the city of Tyre under siege, he sent a requisition for supplies to several places, including Judea. And when that message was received by the chief magistrate at Jerusalem, a high priest named Jaddas, it was refused, since the Jews professed allegiance only to Persia, their previous captors. Alexander was angered at the rebuff and determined, after he had taken Tyre, the enemies of God, to destroy to Jerusalem. Knowing of the terror of this Greek, speaking of Alexander, the Jews at Jerusalem began to tremble at the prospect of his wrath. They began to tremble at the prospect of Alexander the Great, who fulfilled God's promise and God's prophecy in this moment to ban the enemies of God. He defeats them. They no longer exist. Alexander goes in and turns them into a rubble. And yet then he begins to turn his gaze on Jerusalem, and as a result, the people of God are scared. And then according to Josephus, Jaddas caused sacrifices to be offered to God. This is the high priest. Stands in front of the people of God and says, hey, we need to make sacrifices so that this doesn't happen, so that God has our back. And he makes these sacrifices, and it says a prayer to be made for the protection of the holy city. We've rebuilt this place. It's been 200 years. God's given us His prophecy. Let's stand on His word. Because if you go back to Zechariah chapter 9, verse 8, it says, then I will encamp at my house as a guard, so that none shall march to and fro. See, the first 7 verses of chapter 9 talk about the prophecy of God's enemies being destroyed. And then in verse 8, God says, after they're destroyed, I will protect you. And here the people of God have Alexander the Great standing in their face going, hey, if you don't get right, I'm coming for you next. And they, in fear, go and begin to worship God. In fear, they go and worship God. And here's what Josephus writes. It is recorded that the Lord spoke to the high priest in a dream and told him to have no fear, for Jerusalem would not be captured. In fact, the Jews were instructed to throw open the gates of the city and to go forth in a splendid procession to meet the approaching conqueror. This sounds exactly like my God. right? Like, hey, here's what you think you should do to prepare for battle. No, open the gates, throw a party. It's going to be okay. And do it, Josephus says, the vision says this, without the dread of any ill consequences, which would prevent the providence of God. How'd you like to be that priest in that moment? I just got a dream from God that sounds a little crazy, right? And I have to go put me and everyone else in harm's way because of this dream, because of this promise. And he knows what the scriptures say because he's a man of God. He knows the promise. But he could also be thinking, well, hold on now. It took 200 years for those first 7 verses to come true. I don't have another 200 years. I've only got it right now, and I want to live once pretty well, right? Like, there's no YOLO in this situation. And so the priests, dressed in their ceremonial robes, they led the citizens forth to greet Alexander. Led the citizens forth to greet Alexander, right? They didn't get the army ready. They led the citizens out there. And when the Greek general approached this devout multitude, rather than exhibiting his anger, he saluted the high priest and seemed to pay religious homage to him. When questioned regarding his strange conduct, Alexander gave this explanation. He declared that before he had departed from Macedonia, he had experienced a dream in which this very high priest had appeared to him. In the dream, the king was told that his army would proceed under divine conduct, and that through him the Persians would be defeated. Subsequently, Alexander then entered the city of Jerusalem and joined with the high priest in offering sacrifices in the temple to God. Like, do you see this picture? The crazy message of God, or the seemingly crazy message of God, goes to the people. Hey, I know that he said he's going to murder you and plunder and kill and steal and destroy and all those good things, but hey, just open your gates and let them in and worship me, and I'll handle the rest. And they do so, and Alexander arrives, also then having a dream prior, which they didn't know about, and he arrives and goes, hey, I see your faith, so I'll worship with you. Now, I don't want you to all of a sudden read into this like Alexander was all of a sudden a follower of God, because this was not the case. This is not a moment where all of a sudden God just, redeemed Alexander. This is a moment that was very typical in that nation and really those cultures of the day of you have your God, I have my God, we can just put them together and it's all cool. And so Alexander kind of just joins in the ritual. And then it says that the high priest showed Alexander a copy of the scroll containing the writings of Daniel, where it was declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians. That's Daniel chapter 7, verse 6, Daniel chapter 8, verses 3 and 8, also a little bit in chapter 11. Alexander was deeply impressed, deeply moved. He treated the Jews with considerable kindness. Not only did he not assault the city, but he also allowed them to practice their laws and their religion. And what it shows us through this moment is that even in the midst of storms and battles that you and I could never fathom, God is sovereign. Like, think about those situations of those people. The storm is here. They know the promise, but they're not seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. And yet God, through his mysterious sovereign ways, works it all out, and his prophecies are fulfilled, and his people are protected. But let's go back. You're those folks trying to build a wall, trying to build a temple. It's not 332 BC. It's now 532 BC. How do we trust the promise in the midst of the storm? How do we know if it's Friday when Jesus is crucified that Sunday is coming? Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. It says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Now what you and I know is that prophecy in 532 BC will then be fulfilled by Jesus our Lord. Today, Palm Sunday, Jesus enters the city. Not like a normal king on a horse sitting high and mighty with his military arms near, but no, as a humble servant entering in on a donkey. That's Palm Sunday. Matthew chapter 21. Now when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethphage, to the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, The Lord needs them, and he will send them at once. This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, Say to the daughter of Zion, Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. Here is how we lean in. You and I have seen the wonders and the majesty of God. They are not coincidence. They are not just things that happen in the universe and they just fell here. You can leave these doors and look around you and go, did something just go bang and we got here? No. It didn't. The creation cries for a creator. We exist because of God. We exist for God. His evidence is all around us. The Hebrew writer in chapter 11 says, now faith. Here's how we do it. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. How did the Jews push through in those moments? They hoped in the promise. They had seen God work in the past, and they will see God work in the future. We have to let go of the present. You and I are too focused on the storm that surrounds us today. We need to lift our eyes and look to heaven and go, on the horizon, the King is coming. The King is coming. And the next time he comes, he's not going to come on a donkey. He is going to come in mighty power. And he will redeem all things. He will restore all brokenness. And you and I can sit with him. How do we do this on a regular basis? How do we have faith in the promise in the midst of the storm? God gives us a way. He tells us to remember. He tells us to remember. He gives us an ordinance for the church. He says that you, as who you are, you're going to go through, and he saw this several times as he walked with the disciples, that we're going to forget, we're going to take our eyes off the prize, and we're going to focus on the storm around us. But what God does in this moment with his disciples sitting around the table, before he's going to be arrested, before he's going to be tried and murdered, before he's going to be resurrected, he looks at his disciples and says, troubles are going to come. Storms are going to come your way. But the way you get through them, the way that you trust the promise, is to remember. Remember. This Bible that we hold is not just a collection of good teachings. It is the story of God redeeming his people. And when we fall short and we stumble in faith, and when the storm is raging in on our lives, he says, even if you can't pick out a moment in your life, even if for some reason you've blocked it out, maybe through spiritual warfare, and Satan has his grip on you in those moments, even if that's the case, which I would push back and say it's likely not even completely the case, because you can look around you and see an evidence for a good God. But even if it is, he says, look to my word. It's sharper than any two-edged sword. And in this, you will see time after time after time after time the goodness of my character. It may not happen the way you want it to, but God is in control of the storm. And we talked about this in our For the Church course several times now. Sometimes the storm exists to draw you closer to Him. Like, that's not always news that we want to know and hear and talk about, but the storms of this life may be there to draw you closer to Him. And so I just replied to my friend who reached out to me, struggling with life and questioning faith and how to get through the storm, and I said, press on with endurance. Lean into God. My life verse is Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us strip aside everything, every sin that clings so tightly and pulls us down, and let us run the race with endurance, because Jesus, with the cross set before Him, fixed His eyes on the Lord. And we are to do the same thing. We are to fix our eyes on God and run the race with endurance. And so when the storms in your life come, know that the promise is near. You may not see it the way and the when you want to, but the promise is near. Remember God's goodness. Remember His goodness.